The classical period of Greek history was one of the greatest efflorescences of culture in world history. Building on the foundations developed in the Archaic period, Greek culture and society continued to evolve at a rapid pace from the end of the Greco-Persian Wars in 480 until the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE. By the end of the classical period, history, philosophy, rhetoric, and more all existed as established disciplines. The artistic norms of the classical era remain with us down to the present. Despite the enduring impact of many classical developments, however, we should be mindful that not every classical seed bore fruit, and that while there are strong links between classical Greece and Western modernity, it would be a mistake to ignore the differences and focus only on the parallels and antecedents. By the classical period, if not slightly before that, the polis was the standard social, economic, political, and cultural unit organizing life in the Greek world. Polis is often translated as city-state, and that's not completely wrong. It was typically a physical city surrounded by a countryside controlled by that city. However, there's a lot more to it than that. It was not just a politically independent city with a bit of land around it. For the Greeks, their home polis was the core of their identity, and it was their North Star culturally, religiously, and in many other ways. Each polis was made up of many oikoi. An oikos is a household or family. And the oikos was every bit as important as the polis in terms of orienting someone's life and identity. These were the two real pillars that made someone who they were. They belonged to an oikos, and they also belonged to their polis. And these were the two things they participated in. We have to remember, and this is true of all pre-modern times, including ancient Greece, that there was limited social mobility. This means that it was very hard to become wealthier than your parents. It was not normal to switch careers and do something different than what your parents had done before you. And there weren't that many opportunities to advance oneself as an individual in a way that would lead to a greater level of wealth than what one's parents had enjoyed. For most Greeks, the amount of wealth that they would have in their life was already determined at birth, and this is what they would inherit upon their parents' death. Their ancestral oikos was crucial. The oikos often included a workshop or some other family business, maybe a farmstead, and this would be the source of income for most free Greeks, especially Greeks who were citizens. So one of the key duties of any Greek would be to maintain his oikos, and it was considered also a duty for the polis because the polis was composed of the oikoi, and it needed to have men of different generations to serve in the polis's army, and also to pay taxes, perform labor, and do other things to keep the polis functioning. Now, there was a little bit of social mobility in the classical period. It was a period of economic expansion, but it is not anything like the kind of social mobility that exists today. It's not comparable at all. It was a rare occurrence when someone would rise a class or more. And usually when someone would rise up out of obscurity to become wealthy, this was something that had happened over a few generations, where you'd had prosperity a few generations in a row, and it took, say, 3 generations of unbroken prosperity for someone to go from just being an average citizen to being wealthy enough to be a prominent politician. It's also worth mentioning that one's polis identity was very important, not just because of how people were raised and how they were oriented internally, but also because each polis was extremely restrictive about citizenship. This is not like in the modern world where you can move to another country go through a naturalization process, and after a set number of years and a written test, become a citizen. Typically speaking, only one place would ever offer you citizenship, and that was the polis you were born in. If you lost that citizenship, you would probably never again have a chance to acquire citizenship. So, because of that, when we read about people going into exile in ancient Greece, that actually was a severe punishment, and that is why many people who were exiled chose to fight civil wars against their own polis, because this was, in many ways, cutting them off from the only source of identity that they had ever known and that they ever could know. Classical Greeks did see a shared kinship between different Greek polis. They understood that they shared a common language and culture, but ultimately, when push came to shove, that shared commonality amongst the Greeks paled in comparison with the sense of kinship that they felt with members of their own polis. If you were to ask a Greek in modern terms, what is their country, they would not tell you Greece, they would tell you Athens, or Argos, or Corinth. That to them was at the core of who they were. Being Greek was of secondary importance. When we think about Greek culture today, we typically think of a highly rational culture where people were using logic to try to learn more about the world around them. And there is a lot of truth in that, but there is another side as well. The Greeks were very religious. Classical Greeks believed that their gods and goddesses controlled their lives. The goddess Demeter, for instance, controlled the harvest. Without her blessings, people would starve. Poseidon controlled the sea. Without his support, ships would not get to their destinations. There were gods and goddesses of the winds, there were the fates, there were the furies. All of these various gods and goddesses were an integral part of how the world worked. And for the Greeks, the world was largely incomprehensible without the operation of their deities. Each polis had slightly different versions of the different gods and goddesses, and also the myths that went with those gods and goddesses varied a little bit depending on where you were. And as you might imagine, the variances typically involved how important your particular home polis was to that god or goddess, or whether Heracles journeyed to your polis or not. Those were the kinds of details that were pretty commonly variant between places. Each polis had its own patron deity. Typically, the patron deity would have a temple located on the city's Acropolis. The Acropolis was typically the highest point in any given polis, usually in the very center, and that would be the point around which the rest of the community was constructed. Usually you had a city or town with a high point on the highest hill, you'd have the Acropolis, and then you'd have some land outside of it, and that would be the whole thing. Most polis were actually very, very small, by the way. Most of the ones we can name were fairly atypical, but your average polis was quite small. At any rate, there people would perform sacrifices and rituals to honor their patron deity and hope for blessings and prosperity. To give an example, in Athens, the patron deity was Athena Polios, Athena of the city, and her cult was located on the Acropolis in the second largest temple on the top. So the temple of Athena Polios is not the Parthenon. The Parthenon is a different structure, which was primarily used as a treasury. And the priestess of Athena Polios was the most powerful religious official in all of Athens, and there was one woman who was the priestess of Athena Polios for about 40 years, who was almost universally feared by every man in the city, all of whom were terrified of trying to debate with her on any matter of religious significance. And that says a lot, because in the classical period especially, the Greeks were a relatively contentious, argumentative lot. So if you see men who are terrified to debate someone, it means that they are truly considered to be a fearsome and formidable expert on a given topic. Almost all priesthoods, by the way, were inherited. Even in democratic Athens, it was aristocratic families that would pass down the priesthood from generation to generation. And as I mentioned with the priestess of Athena Polios, it was actually more normal for high-ranking religious officials to be women than men. So while men did dominate in politics, women were more important in religion. And this is because the belief was that women were a little bit more in touch with the gods, a little bit more susceptible to their influence. That's not to say that men didn't have power in religion, they certainly did. But if anything, women had a little bit more. There's a tendency for people to assume that because Athens had a democracy, that there was a strong emphasis placed on equality among the Greeks. But the reality is that in most polis, including democratic Athens, there were stark dividing lines of class and status. By class, of course, I mean how much money someone had in their oikos, and by status, I mean whether one was free or slave, citizen or non-citizen. Both your class and your status would massively impact how you lived your life. The top of the social hierarchy, you won't be surprised to learn, was occupied by citizen males. But among the citizen males, only the ones who had a significant amount of money had any real political power, typically speaking. And this is particularly true if their family claimed aristocratic status. And the difference between being merely rich and being an aristocrat is that aristocrats would claim that their families were descended from some of the mythological gods and heroes, whereas someone who was merely rich would not make that claim, and their family would have only become wealthy within living memory. So there would be less prestige attached to their money, but they would still be able to lead a life of leisure. Another reason why money was so important to political participation is because you needed leisure. If you were poor, you had to spend most of your time working. You didn't have time to try to learn how to read and then write speeches to deliver in front of your fellow citizens. And also, as we'll discover, many of the political systems in place in Greece at this time mandated that someone have a certain amount of money in order to participate at all. Metics were resident aliens. These are Greeks who were citizens elsewhere, but resided abroad due mostly to business opportunities, or sometimes due to political exile. Sometimes they just simply weren't welcome at home, so they had to go elsewhere to try to make a living. Typically, metics were not allowed to own land in the place where they lived, and they had to rent a home. You could make a lot of money as a metic, and many metics were quite prosperous. A number of metics set up banks, businesses. Some metic women were high-class prostitutes or courtesans, and they actually could make a lot of money by being effectively call girls or professional escorts. At the bottom of the social hierarchy were slaves. Many slaves were non-Greek prisoners of war. Other slaves were actually Greeks who typically also were prisoners of war. But there were other ways to fall into slavery. One way, of course, was to be born into it to slave parents. Being a slave is clearly not what one would want to experience, as in any society. Now, when we talk about the experience of slaves in classical Athens and in Greece more broadly, we should keep in mind that our evidence is rather limited. But we do know that in Athens in particular, the experience of slaves could vary dramatically. Some slaves were skilled craftsmen who were owned by another person, but were permitted to basically live in their own house, raise their own family, and then the condition of their slavery is that they would have to pay a certain amount of their earnings to their master every year or however often. There were other people who lived on farms or in workshops with their masters and had to work side by side with them. There were also some larger scale operations, nothing on the scale of, say, a southern plantation, but some fairly large farming operations by Greek standards, and some factories that would produce shields and other things that would be needed, and they could work in groups of dozens at a time. There also were some slaves who were pornai, we get the word pornography from this. Porni were lower class slaves, basically slaves who just did strictly sexual deeds. So these are not high class courtesans who also could play instruments and do things like that. And they would work at brothels. But at the very bottom of the slave hierarchy, there were the mine slaves at Larion. These are the mines where the Athenians got most of their famous silver. And the evidence is a little thin, but if what we think we know is accurate, then it would mean that the average life expectancy for slaves who were put into these mines was only about 6 months. And if that is true, then that would mean that mine slavery at Larion would be one of the absolute worst forms of slavery of any society that has ever existed. Now, granted, we don't know for sure if this was the case, but what I want to convey is that the experience of slaves could vary wildly in Athens. And there were even a couple of cases where a slave would have a really important skill, such as the public slaves who would help magistrates to fulfill their duties. These would be slaves who could read and write, so they would be pretty well treated. There were also slaves who were banking experts, and sometimes if their master died without a child, the master would then adopt the slave and have the slave become a citizen, because the slave's knowledge and services would be so needed by the polis that it'd actually accept him as a citizen. And as we mentioned, polis were very, very reluctant to do stuff like that. So the experiences could vary wildly depending on the skill set a slave had and the need at the time and things like that. It's always hard to really generalize about what slavery is like without missing a lot of the nuances of it. But suffice it to say that you would be infinitely better off being free than being enslaved. And that applies to any period where slavery exists. The Athenian philosopher Plato once described the Greeks as frogs around a pond. What he was getting at is that the Greeks tended to live either near the sea or navigable rivers. For the Greeks, trade by water was essential to their survival. This was something that was absolutely necessary for them economically. The majority of polis were tiny and had rather simple economies. Most of them would only produce one product, maybe two, and then they would need to trade that product and get other things in return to have all of the necessities of life. For most Greeks, the normal job, I guess you could say, was subsistence farming. That is farming where you effectively meet all of your needs but don't really turn much of a profit. You farm to continue to live in order to continue to farm. Sometimes subsistence farmers would own no slaves, or occasionally one, maybe two, but the point is that they were breaking even pretty much every year, with an occasional year where they'd make a bit of profit or a year where they might have to incur a bit of debt to keep going. When you look at larger polis, however, such as Athens, Argos, Thebes, and Corinth, the economies there were much more varied and complex. There, it was possible to make a living as a merchant or as a craftsman. You could be a professional shoemaker or a smith. You could be someone who specializes in banking. There are a lot of different things that were done in cities that you would not see in a small polis with only 100 citizens. This also means that if you needed to find specialty products, you might need to take a trip, and because of the conditions of this world, such a trip would be a rarity. Say if you live in a very small polis, you might have to journey to Athens or somewhere else in order to find something that you need or want. Most goods were transported using pottery. We tend to think of pottery more as art, and much of it was. Some of it was used purely for decoration, and it was made for the wealthy. But most pottery was utilitarian, and was actually made to transport grain, olive oil, wine, and other products that the Greeks tended to ship around throughout their world and beyond. And in fact, the Greeks were so accustomed to using pottery to transport things that our largest collection of pottery sherds of Athenian origin in the world is actually located in Carthage, which of course is non-Greek. In the agora of large cities, you would have a huge marketplace. This is where public business would be conducted. This is also where a lot of intellectuals would meet and debate, and where politicians would meet and talk about the issues of the day, but it's also this major business center where people would hawk their wares. You could go here and buy food for the day or food for a longer period. Typically speaking, you would not be able to buy food for a long period though, because there were no preservatives in this time. So you typically buy food for your family for a day or two at a time. At Athens, which had the most varied economy of all and the most overall prosperity, there were book stalls where hand-copied scrolls would be available for a single drachma. And a drachma would be the equivalent of a day's pay for a skilled laborer. So if you were a well-regarded mason, for instance, you would make about a drachma a day. So that gives you a sense of how expensive books were. They were much more expensive relative to the amount of money people had than books are today. But at the same time, they were not completely inaccessible or at such a level of expense that they were unattainable. It's also worth noting that we've done excavations and we know that even in a place that was generally prosperous such as Athens, based on the mass graves that were created during the Peloponnesian War due to the plague, we know that most Athenians were actually malnourished. And they were the richest of the Greeks, or close to the richest of the Greeks. So we should also keep in mind that in relative terms, when compared with modernity, the Greeks were quite poor. But compared with many of their neighbors, they were fairly well off, and the Athenians were, compared to the other Greeks, wealthy. In spite of the graphic that I selected for this slide, the reality is that in classical Greece, there were typically only three kinds of constitutional arrangement: tyranny, oligarchy, democracy. We'll start with tyranny, which is frequently misunderstood. A tyranny is where you have one man with the backing of a large proportion of the citizens and who ultimately ruled by force. The word tyranny only gained the negative connotations that we apply to it today as we're nearing the end of the classical period. For the most part, tyrants before that point were viewed fairly favorably. After all, they did ride a wave of popularity to get to where they were. It's also worth noting that tyrants in the classical period were not common. Most of the tyrants that we know of were in the archaic period, and if we're talking about tyrants from the classical period, we're mostly talking about a handful of rulers who presided over Syracuse on Sicily, and a couple of Syracuse's neighbors, such as the city of Gela. But in mainland Greece especially, tyrants were not terribly common. So we can kind of move on from that. And by the way, many of the negative connotations about tyrants came to us from the works of Plato and Aristotle. We move on to oligarchy. This is actually the most common form of government in ancient Greece. Now, obviously, democracy is what we typically think of when we think of classical Greece, but in fact, oligarchy was more common. An oligarchy means rule of the few, and in practice, what that means is rule of the rich. Now, on the chart on the right, it says that it's a small group of wealthy nobles. An oligarchy does not require that you have an aristocratic pedigree. It does require, however, that you meet a wealth requirement. So effectively, an oligarchy is a system where once you had a certain amount of wealth, you could participate. If you fall below that threshold, you are no longer eligible to participate. Oligarchy could really vary in its forms by quite a bit. Corinth was often an oligarchy, and it was more typical. This was a city that was economically similar to Athens. It had a lot of sea trade, lots of merchants. You also have Sparta, though, which is technically an oligarchy, but if any of you are familiar with Sparta, you know that Sparta is quite complex and frankly weird, where you have a warrior aristocracy supported by a working class that is effectively collectively enslaved to the warrior aristocracy. You also have some people running around who conduct business on the frontiers. Sparta's society is very, very different than most Greek societies. And that's why I have not paid much attention to it here, because it is so atypical of what is going on for the majority of the Greeks. As for democracies, while they are not as common as oligarchies, they're not rare either. And in fact, Athens was far from the only democracy. The variation among democracies is in how radical they were. And by radical, what the critics of democracy meant is that some democracies were very inclusive. So it would be considered a radical democracy if you got to participate in the process of government, even if you own no property and you only had citizenship. So Athens was a radical democracy because so long as you were an adult male citizen, regardless of how much money you had, you could vote and hold a few offices and do other things that were appropriate for a citizen. What's also interesting is that if you look at the way that democracies and oligarchies worked, both of them are fairly similar in that the people who qualified to be a part of the government would meet and debate and deliberate. So in many ways, you could argue that oligarchy and democracy were very similar systems that operated along the same spectrum. And the spectrum is just how many people get to be included or excluded. But this was a very contentious issue for the people involved. If you were excluded because you did not have enough wealth, or if you felt that your power and your glory were being diluted by the inclusion of poor people, this would be something that would very much inflame the feelings of Greek men. And so in each polis, there were typically democratic and oligarchic factions. And if they had the opportunity, they often would be willing to work with an outside power to seize power internally and put their enemies to death. Civil wars in the classical Greek world were very common, and they often broke down along the democratic versus oligarchic line. So that is something that is especially in effect during the Peloponnesian War, where Athens and Sparta would try to find people within different polis to be their allies, and they would use those guys in order to gain control of different areas. There were many pottery workshops around the Greek world, but the two places most known for producing pottery were Athens and Corinth. By the late Archaic period, Athens had taken the lead, and this in part served to spur the Athenian economy to greater and greater heights. In terms of style, Athens became completely dominant around 530 or so BCE with the development of red figure. Red figure became the standard across the Greek world throughout the classical period, and most of it, or at least a very large percentage, was manufactured in Athens. So that enabled a little bit more detail in terms of the art that you see on the pottery, as compared with the prior black figure technique. Statues also evolved in this time to be more realistic and to display more movement. Archaic statues tended to be a bit more plain. The features weren't quite as detailed. But in classical art, all of the muscles are finely realized, and statues can even be posed, as this statue by Praxiteles shows. This is a leaning satyr. Greek art came to value youth and typically portrayed all the gods as appearing to be people without any sort of flaw or blemish who were in their early 20s. So most Greek statues, especially if they're portraying the gods, will portray them as being in their absolute physical prime and also as being in very, very good shape. Praxiteles was the greatest of the Greek sculptors. He was an Athenian who lived in the 4th century, and it was his work especially around the 360s or so, which really took Greek sculpture to its highest level. Not surprisingly, architecture experienced a similar advancement. Temples at this time grew larger, and more importantly, they became much more complex. The shape changed as well. They had always been more rectangular than anything, but in the Archaic period, they tended to be a little bit closer to being square. As the classical period came into its own and classical architecture evolved, temples became longer and more narrow. They also became more ornate. Greek sculptors got better at working in decorations, friezes, and other refinements which enabled more visual storytelling within a temple and also on the outer displays as well. There also were a lot more tricks that were used to make temples appear a certain way. One famous example is at the Parthenon, where the Athenians realized that to make their temple appear to have perfect alignment for all of the columns when you looked from the front to the back, you would actually have to strategically make it crooked. That's the only way it would appear to the eye to look straight. Otherwise, if you make it perfectly straight, which they were capable of doing, it wouldn't quite appear straight and it wouldn't have that visual effect. So they engaged in a lot of fine art in that way. And many of the artists were professionals who only did that for a living, and so their level of skill was supreme. Most of them also had parents who had taught them. So this was, for many of them, a family business and something that they were amazingly gifted at. We should also keep in mind that the spending on art and architecture was immense by the standards of the time. And a lot of this is because much of this art is in honor of the gods and goddesses, and as we mentioned at the outset, the Athenians and other Greeks believed that gods and goddesses controlled most aspects of their lives. So spending money on things to honor them was a wise decision and something that would pay dividends. The building of the Athenian Acropolis complex, of which the Parthenon is only one part, actually took a few decades and an immense amount of money to complete. And part of that is because you had to hire the very best masons and architects in the Greek world and import precious stone from Paros and other places to complete the thing. So art and architecture was something that advanced in large part because the classical Greeks were able to generate so much wealth and develop so much expertise in their arts. During the Archaic period, the Greeks had developed lyric poetry and epic poetry. However, it was only toward the end of the Archaic period when they began to experiment with drama and other forms of stage production. The Athenians only began to perform plays in honor of the god Dionysus around the year 530 BCE. It was only after the construction of the theater of Dionysus after 480, however, when Athenian drama truly entered its classical phase. And it was at this stage, between about 470 and the end of the Peloponnesian War in 404, where the Athenians would witness many of the most famous plays in the Western tradition being performed for the very first time. The three most famous Athenian playwrights were Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. All of them worked in this period, one after the other, with some overlap. And between them they wrote dozens and dozens of plays, although unfortunately most of them have been lost. Yet enough of them have survived, including Aeschylus's Persians and Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, that we have a pretty good feel for how the Athenian theater functioned. Most of the dramas that were presented, at least most of the dramas that we have in surviving form, draw heavily on Greek myth for their characters and settings, but they still provided the playwrights with opportunities to discuss both the human condition and contemporary problems. For instance, one of Sophocles' plays deals with Ajax and how Ajax was having a mental breakdown in the middle of the Trojan War. And I think modern scholars have come up with a very convincing interpretation that what Sophocles is describing is PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, where Ajax is mentally breaking down after having been exposed to too much violence for too long a time, and he is psychologically breaking. We also have to keep in mind that all three of these men were Athenian citizens and therefore would have served in battle. In fact, Sophocles was a politician and a general in Athens, in addition to being a playwright. So these are people who would have experienced such things. So when they're writing about these harrowing events, these are things that they would have experienced in some form or fashion themselves, and that might be why they are so convincing, why their work resonates as much as it does. Classical Athens had three popular genres of stage performance, not just drama. Another one were the so-called satyr plays. These were comedic spoofs of mythological subjects. They were popular in the classical period, but they fizzled out over time and ended up not really impacting the larger Western tradition. In fact, I think that these are something that had kind of lost a lot of their significance by about the middle of the 5th century, so they barely even survived the classical period. Certainly none of them have really survived, so this was not something that had nearly the impact of drama or the emergent practice of comedy. Old comedy emerged in the 480s or so and would really rise to its greatest level under the playwright Aristophanes, who lived around the time of the Peloponnesian War. Aristophanes was much more contemporary in his focus, and in many ways his comedy was more in line with something like South Park. He would look at contemporary issues and key figures and pillory them endlessly. Some people that he made fun of included some of the prominent Athenian generals during the Peloponnesian War. They also included Socrates, who of course was a philosopher, although Aristophanes calls him a sophist, and also Cleon. Cleon was a popular leader in Athens who had very strong enemies, but also, of course, some very ardent supporters, and Aristophanes was clearly not a big fan of him. He also wrote one play where the women of Athens were so sick of the war that they went on a sex strike against their husbands until the war ended. After the Peloponnesian War, as the 4th century began, a new genre of comedy would emerge that is known as new comedy. And effectively what this is a comedy which is based much more on tropes, archetypal characters, and everyday life. It is aggressively apolitical. So it would just be about young men trying to get with women and going through some shenanigans to try to make that happen, or grouchy parents, or a smart slave outwitting a dumb master, or just kind of these sort of slice of life moments that more people could relate to and that didn't really stir controversy. New comedy survived outside of the classical period. It was very popular in the Hellenistic age, which was an age where politics was effectively dead in the classical sense. There weren't really any great debates anymore. And also during the Roman period, the Romans also enjoyed translated versions of new comedy. So new comedy, while today we think of it as being more like Modern Family or some kind of sitcom, in its own time this was seen as something that was safe and also sufficiently entertaining. Most people today, I think, see old comedy as being more productive or more interesting, but for people at the time who were tired of politics, new comedy certainly had its appeal. Before the classical period, there was no systematic study of the past. The Greeks had plenty of interest in where they came from, but no one before the classical period had bothered to create a detailed prose account trying to construct a larger picture of the world of the past and how it all fit together and how it worked. But that would all change with the birth of history. Hecataeus of Miletus is the first known historian. Unfortunately, his work is lost to us except for the parts of it that Herodotus paraphrases in his own work. According to Herodotus, Hecataeus visited Egypt and proudly presented his aristocratic pedigree, where he claimed that ultimately his ancestors were gods and heroes. But when the Egyptians examined his claims, they told him that based on their own genealogical records, that his claims were impossible. Because, they said, not only were there no gods and heroes at the time that he claims his ancestors lived, but also the origin of man was prior to what Hecataeus was claiming. And the Greeks tended to realize that the Egyptians represented a much more ancient culture, and so they began to look at their own past with a bit more skepticism. That's not to say that they ever abandoned a belief in the gods or goddesses or their mythology, but they did begin to perceive that perhaps things were not quite the way that they had thought. So they began to look critically. Herodotus of Halicarnassus is usually called the father of history, and he openly admits that he was very much inspired by Hecataeus and was attempting to do what he did, but with a twist. The twist is that rather than simply describing the world, Herodotus was trying to describe the world around him and its history with a view toward explaining the Greco-Persian wars of the 490s and 480s. So his history began a generation or so before that and ended around 479 when the war between the Free Greeks and the Persian Empire came to an end. Herodotus actually wrote in about the 440s or 430s, by the way, so he wrote a full generation later. And in fact, there are some theories that he might have been alive until about the 420s or so. So he's writing a while later, and a lot of the traditions that he draws on are not firsthand. After Herodotus, another man was supposedly inspired by Herodotus, and that would be Thucydides, son of Olorus of Athens. He wrote a history of the Peloponnesian War. This history does not go into all of the detail about Egypt and Persia and all of that. This is simply the story of the war between Athens and Sparta. And in this history, Thucydides tries to lay out his claims about human nature, about what causes conflict, about how great powers come into conflict with one another. So Thucydides is writing that work, and he dies before it's completed. His account leaves off in the year 411 or so, so Xenophon, who is another student of Socrates, decides to take up the task where Thucydides left off, and he finishes the story of the Peloponnesian War and carries down Greek history to the Battle of Leuctra, where the Spartan army was smashed by the Thebans, and Sparta's hegemony ended. Xenophon was an Athenian who was very much a pro-Spartan guy. He was sufficiently pro-Spartan that he actually chose to live in Sparta and became best friends with one of the kings there. So he had a very interesting perspective, and I think he's an underrated historian because his views are interesting to say the least, and also he knew more about how military affairs worked than either Herodotus or Thucydides, at least in my opinion. What historians would do is they would record the deeds of man using oral and written sources. In some cases, these would be direct from the horse's mouth, that is to say, they would interview eyewitnesses. Other times, they would visit a place themselves and read an inscription, or they would interview the son or grandson of someone who was at a battle and get their version of the story. But despite the fact that they are drawing upon what other people tell them, they are exercising critical judgment on what is plausible, what is possible, and what makes sense. Obviously, they would be getting conflicting accounts, and they were trying to use their best judgment and logic to determine what was most likely to be true. Herodotus frequently used the phrase, or the verbiage, that he was about to relate a story, but he didn't know for sure whether it was true or not, meaning that he would relay it and leave it to the reader to decide whether or not one should take the story seriously. So that is where history came from, and those are some examples of early historians who gave us a more complete version of events at that time than we would otherwise have. And this is part of why we know so much more about the classical period than the archaic period, because we have historians working in that period writing about it, whereas during the archaic period, history has not yet been invented, and no one wrote anything comparable to Herodotus, Thucydides, or Xenophon's histories. In the classical period, the art of rhetoric was born, and the men who practiced it flourished. There are a number of reasons why rhetoric was created, and also why it became so popular. The classical Greek world was quite prosperous, and that prosperity brought with it a need to be a better public speaker. There were simply more occasions upon which one would be expected to speak, whether we're talking about addressing audiences for entertainment purposes, and yes, there were people who were display orators. A lot of common people would actually pay money to attend while someone would just deliver a speech that they wrote because it sounded really good. That was a thing. There were also a lot of court cases. During this time, law systems really started to develop, and you would have some fairly intense legal battles. The better speaker you were, the more likely you were to convince other people that you were in the right. Politically speaking, as we mentioned, government was participatory, whether we're talking about an oligarchy or a democracy, and so the ability to speak well was at a premium. Also, if you are a diplomat from one polis to another, then the ability to speak persuasively and eloquently was obviously at a premium. There were professional teachers of oratory. Many of them were itinerant, that means they travel around, and they would go between the major polis and take on mostly elite students who could pay them a hefty fee for their teaching. These teachers, who often called themselves either sophists, which meant wise men in Greek, or philosophers, which meant lovers of wisdom, would teach a variety of subjects, everything from mathematics to things about the natural world to a little bit of history. And the expectation is that by teaching all of these things to young men and also teaching them about rhetorical devices, teaching them how to control their voices, how to pace themselves to get through long orations, how to make dramatic pauses, things of that nature, that ultimately when these young men came of age and started to participate in the political process, they'd be much more likely to be persuasive, to be more likely to be effective in that arena. These increasing standards for eloquence also led to the rise of a group of men called logographers, and these are men who wrote court speeches for others. So this is a slightly different subgenre of rhetoric. Typically speaking, however, there were no lawyers in the Greek world. Lawyers are actually a Roman invention. The Greeks would represent themselves in court. So a logographer would write a speech for another man and either teach it to him and help him memorize it, or just hand him a script with the speech, and if that man could read, then he would memorize it himself. You could make a living being a logographer, by the way. And actually, who's the most famous logographer would be Lysias, who was a medic in Athens. He wrote a number of these speeches for clients. And even Demosthenes seems to have made some extra money on the side doing this in between his great political orations. In classical Greece, literacy was almost certainly higher than the ancient standard of about 10%. There are estimates that think that we're maybe about 25 to 30% of men in classical Athens could read and write. Now, how well they could read and write, we don't really know. Most likely not all that well, except for the men who were men of letters, such as the aforementioned Demosthenes or the philosopher Plato. But certainly it was higher than the 10% that we think was typical of the ancient world as a whole. The man I have pictured here is one of the most famous of the sophists, Protagoras, who today is largely remembered because he was a character in one of Plato's dialogues. Protagoras' most famous saying is that man is the measure of all things, of the reality of those which are, and of the unreality of those which are not. And the reason why I highlight this is because even though he is seen mostly as a sophist, the fact is that Protagoras' interests clearly go beyond talking and rhetoric. He also would have identified himself as being something of a philosopher, someone interested in getting to know the nature of things. Earlier I mentioned that philosophy literally means the love of wisdom. That is worth keeping in mind. Going into the classical period, there were no bounds on what philosophers did and did not study. It was only at the end of the classical period, and primarily due to the influence of one person we'll get to, that philosophy became more truncated. Another factor, of course, is that as other disciplines arose, such as drama and history, this did take away things from the all-encompassing realm of philosophy, but it was really the influence of one single philosopher which very much shaped philosophy into what it has become since the classical period. But we'll get there in a bit. First, let's look at some of the most prominent classical philosophers, many of whom have not survived to the present in terms of giving us long passages of their work. Most of the guys I'm about to tell you about exist in small fragments, and we know from those fragments that these were men who would write their thoughts in poetry rather than in prose. First off, we have Xenophanes of Colophon. He was born in the mid-6th century, meaning the late Archaic, and then he lived into the early classical period, dying in the early 5th century. He was known as a social critic who would pillory standard Greek beliefs and practices as being irrational. His most famous observation is that we as humans have no way to know if the gods look like men and women or not. We simply assume that because we are self-centered. He says that if cows and horses could draw gods, they would be drawing cows and horses, not humans. So he was an important social critic for that reason, and that's, of course, his most famous contribution. Heraclitus of Ephesus, the so-called weeping philosopher, was known for his gloomy temperament and for really crying whenever he was confronted with instances of man's folly. But more importantly, he developed the principle of non-contradiction, which is that any argument must not contradict a part of itself. The principle of non-contradiction is not only a standard part of philosophy today, but pretty much a part of almost every academic discipline, or at least it should be. Sometimes it's not enforced, but it is something that I think is a pretty good rule of thumb. If your argument contradicts itself, it doesn't work. But the thing he's best known for is the notion that the universe is always in flux, that the only constant is change, and that we are living through constant change. The way that he summarized this idea was by informing his readers that it is impossible to stand in the same river twice, meaning that because the water flows, when you're standing in a river, the water that's touching you at any given moment is different from the water that will be touching you in the next moment. A little bit after Heraclitus, there was Parmenides, another man who's known to us in many ways because he appeared in a Platonic dialogue. He lived during the early and middle of the 5th century. He studied the nature of reality, and one of his ideas was to explore the concept of whether being able to think of a thing meant that it was real. i.e., if you can think of or imagine a mountain made purely of gold, then surely such a thing exists, or at least is possible. That was Parmenides' chief thought. He also wondered about some of these older arguments that the Greeks had about what was the one true substance, but that's something that was more of an archaic concern. We won't get into that too much. And finally, we have the laughing philosopher, Democritus of Abdera. He lived a little later, He was born in 460 and lived until 370, which means that he was a bit younger than Socrates, but older than Plato. He was known as the first atomist, that is to say that he was the guy who invented the notion that all things are made of smaller, almost invisible, but indivisible parts. So, to say that again, almost invisible, as in not seeable, but indivisible, as in can't be divided further, parts. Of course, today we know that atomism is correct, that all things are made up of smaller parts. We also know that atoms do have smaller parts within them, however. But effectively, Democritus was centuries and centuries ahead of his time. He also had some other unusual beliefs. At the time, most philosophers were not big fans of democracy. A lot of that has to do with the fact that they were aristocrats, and many of them felt that allowing common people to participate in politics impinged upon their ability to get somewhere in politics. But Democritus didn't feel that way. Apparently, he was pretty openly supportive of democracy. And he also was known for his frequent use of humor, hence his nickname of Laughing Philosopher. The picture you see here was a portrait drawn during the Dutch Renaissance. The Dutch apparently really liked what Democritus had to say, and they liked the idea of him being this joking, fun philosopher, as opposed to, say, the very gloomy Heraclitus or the ultra-serious figures who were so typical of classical philosophy. And now we focus in on the two most famous philosophers of the classical world, and arguably the two most famous philosophers in the entire Western tradition, Plato and Aristotle. These, of course, are the two central figures in the painting The School of Athens. They are seen walking down the middle of the aisle debating one another, while all of the others are off to the side. This shows you exactly how influential they are in the Western tradition, and how their role as the central figures of that tradition has been recognized for centuries. We'll start out by talking about Plato. Plato was born in the late 5th century but lived most of his life in the 4th. He was the nephew of an Athenian oligarch who was responsible for murdering the supporters of democracy. However, when democracy was restored, this meant that there was a great deal of prejudice against the people who had supported Plato's uncle, including Plato himself. So effectively, his political ambitions had to go on the shelf. Given his known family orientation, there was no way that he was going to be allowed to participate, and he seems to have been fairly hostile to democracy anyway. He was also a bit of a frustrated wrestler and playwright. We know that he was an avid wrestler, but he never won Olympic glory. So he was not Kurt Angle. He also was not Euripides. He admired playwrights, but could never quite succeed in that arena. His plays were apparently not very good. So ultimately, he decided on being a philosopher. In this endeavor, he was exceptionally successful. He founded a school called the Academy, named after a grove of trees in Athens, dedicated to a group of very obscure gods. The Academy focused almost entirely on ethics and political philosophy. He had very little interest in other topics. He was not looking for the true nature of the universe in terms of whether it was air or fire or water. Those were not concerns for Plato. He was not interested in atomism or anything of that nature. He was interested in the soul, ethics, the relationship between men and gods, and things that are much more in line with what we think of as being philosophy. And not surprisingly, a lot of that is because Plato became such an influential philosopher. So he got to define what the field was in many ways. He ended up writing dialogues instead of more poetic expressions of his thoughts. And his dialogues have mostly survived and represented a huge departure in style from the verse of previous philosophers. It also shows us that he still had some interest in being a playwright, but rather than trying to write in meter, he instead wrote in prose, but still structured his philosophical discourses as conversations between two people or more. And he would often set these in the past, in the era of his youth, when Socrates was still in his prime, wondering about Athens and debating people. Plato's influence was so great that we have a term pre-Socratic which exists entirely because of him. We often look at philosophers prior to the time of Plato and call them pre-Socratic because they do not operate the way that Plato does. They have interests that are not his. They have approaches that are not his. They write in verse. They don't accept the theory of the forms. They don't do the things that Plato would have a philosopher do. But in fact, as we saw, Democritus is actually younger than Socrates. How is he pre-Socratic? They lived and prospered for, most of their lives overlapped. How can he be pre-Socratic? Doesn't make sense. Well, it makes sense because Plato was highly influential, and that's how he wanted us to think about it. And the dichotomy between philosophers and sophists, basically that philosophers seek the truth, whereas sophists are merely in it for the money, and sophists merely exist to make the weaker argument the stronger, rather than seeking the truth, that exists because Plato wanted it to be that way. Plato was competing for students with a lot of these other professional teachers, and he wanted to make it out that he was the only one really seeking truth, whereas everyone else was in it for the money. In reality, all of them probably thought of themselves as truth seekers, and we know for a fact that all of them were in it for the money, including Plato. There's one story where Plato did not accept the student, in part because he didn't think that the young man would be able to meet the fees of the academy, and also because the young man was not really an aristocrat. So Plato did not think that he would be quite up to snuff for the academy. Later on, the man became a famous mathematician, and Plato apologized, but suffice it to say that for all of Plato's high-mindedness in the dialogues about how everyone should be given a chance and how one's merit in the world should be based on their intellectual abilities, not their class status, in reality he was a snob, and he was in it for the money as much as anybody else. Plato had a famous student, Aristotle, who ended up being just as influential, even if he did not quite get to define philosophy in the same way. Aristotle was from a small polis called Stagera off the coast of Macedon, but he went to Athens to study under Plato as a young man and became one of, if not the greatest, of Plato's students. The two of them became quite close. However, after Plato died, Aristotle was infuriated to learn that he was not the heir to the academy. There are probably some good reasons why this was the case, by the way. Aristotle had been Alexander the Great's tutor, and his family had had long ties with the court of Macedon. And Athens and Macedon at this time were pretty hostile. So putting Aristotle in charge of one of the now iconic schools of Athens would be a slap in the face to the Athenians, and they might not take too kindly to it. But Aristotle took it as a personal insult and a rejection by his former teacher, so he started a rival school called the Lyceum, also located in Athens, and he and his followers became known as the Peripatetics, which literally means the pacers. And the reason for that is that Aristotle liked to pace around as he lectured, which apparently was not normal at the time, although I've seen plenty of people do it in the modern world. So I guess it's safe to say anyone who paces while they lecture is drawing on Aristotle. Aristotle was someone who actually considered himself to be a Platonist, and there are passages in his works where he will say, Platonists such as us, or Platonists such as myself. But no one else considered him to be a Platonist because he had founded his own school, and because his teachings would quickly vary from those of Plato. And a lot of that difference is because Aristotle's area of interest is much broader than Plato's. Plato was only really interested in ethics and political philosophy, whereas Aristotle was cut from the older cloth and was actually interested in everything. And he also was more interested in categorizing things based on empirical observations. He liked to collect samples, for instance. He liked to look at the physical characteristics and rely more on sight, sound, and touch, whereas Plato was much more of an abstract thinker. He wanted to do models. He wanted to think about things in their true essence that couldn't be seen or directly detected. And again, although Aristotle thought of himself as a Platonist, no one else did, and over time, their students and successors would very much come to see themselves as holding incompatible views of philosophy, and they would remain rival schools for the rest of antiquity. In fact, even as late as the 1950s, there was a classicist named Gruba who wrote an article, Platonist and Aristotelian, claiming that every philosopher after Plato and Aristotle was ultimately either a Platonist or an Aristotelian. I think that is a bit of an oversimplification, but it does go to show you exactly how influential both of these men were on subsequent Western philosophy. I would like to conclude by considering what are the traits that make the classical Greek world distinctive. One thing that you will notice the more you study it is that the polis is absolutely central to all Greek thought and life. Even Plato and Aristotle, the two greatest philosophers that ancient Greece produced, both of whom lived toward the end of the classical period, were literally incapable of imagining life without the polis. When Plato wrote two works imagining utopias, the Republic and the Laws, both of the societies that he created were very much polis. Each one of them was a self-contained, independent community with its own traditions and laws, and it functioned exactly like any other polis, except that he imagined it as more isolated and following laws that he set down. Aristotle lived at a time when the classical world was at its very end. And in fact, during the very time that he was writing and working in Athens, this is when his former student Alexander the Great was conquering the Persian Empire and creating a Greek world large enough that the polis would become irrelevant in the Hellenistic period. Yet, when he was writing his works on politics, he thought that it was unimaginable to have a full human experience without being a part of a polis. And in fact, he effectively said that anyone who lived without a polis could not be fully human. And that's how he justified saying that Greeks were superior to non-Greeks. So there's a great deal of irony there that he's teaching this exactly at a moment when his most famous student is making sure that such a view will become unreasonable within a decade or two. This era was characterized by intellectual adventurism. There were lots of new ideas, but at the same time, most Greeks were strongly attached to tradition and superstition, and even the Greeks who were developing new ways of thinking about the world still couldn't escape the idea that the polis was the center of existence. There was a growing sense of the importance of the individual, but this was a very slow evolution. And in fact, at both the beginning and the end of the classical period, people's values were primarily communitarian. It was only really in the Hellenistic period that individuals, in a somewhat modern sense, would kind of emerge. But even still, because of the attachment that people had to their home polis and to their oikos, individualism as we think of it was not really possible. There was also a strong sense that common people should have a right to participate in politics to some extent. That was democracy, of course, but this was tempered in most places and prevented by elites who were determined to defend their prerogatives, determined to keep poor people out of politics and have all the power to themselves, which was very much in line with how things were prior to the classical period, and indeed how things would become after the classical period. In fact, democracy is a very rare thing, and it has only flourished on a few occasions, really, one of which was at Athens during the classical period. So democracy is very much the exception, not the rule, if you look at the broad swath of Western history, despite the claim that democracy is one of the key pillars of the Western tradition, it has actually been fairly exceptional. Although priorities shifted along with material conditions after 323 BCE, a lot of the new strands of thought that emerged in the classical period, including, say, the discipline of history, drama, comedy, new art styles, new temple styles, things like that, a lot of those have endured and gone on to influence other things which have very much shaped the world in which we lived. But not, as I mentioned at the outset, not every classical idea bore fruit. For instance, there are no satyr plays really, and urns which used to protect households from evil spirits no longer exist. And we don't have the Eleusinian mysteries or many of the other things that classical Greeks would look at as being absolutely critical parts of their lives. So keep all of that in mind. We owe a great deal to the ancient Greek world, but there were many parts of it that our ancestors ultimately rejected and which we have no interest in today. So that's something that I feel is vital to understand. That's all I have for you right now on classical Greek culture. This was simply an overview rather than a deep dive into it. This is something I could literally talk about all day because it is something that is near and dear to my heart. And unfortunately, I can't think of too many other topics I'd rather talk about, but the fact is that I have to keep moving and talking about things that I'm required to cover.